Scientist laughed at the cleaning lady, until she solved what 32 scientists couldn't. Dorothy Jenkins gripped the mop tightly as she listened to the laughter echoing through the research center. At 52, she knew she was just an invisible employee to those men in white lab coats who thought they were superior to everyone. That's when Dr. Richard Thompson, the lead scientist of the Institute's most important project, decided to turn her humility into a public spectacle. "Everyone, look at this!" he shouted, pointing at Dorothy as she wiped the countertops. "Our dear cleaning lady is staring at our calculations. She must be trying to understand quantum physics." The other researchers burst into laughter, some shaking their heads as if it were the funniest joke in the world. "Dr. Thompson," he continued, speaking directly to Dorothy with sarcasm, "do you understand anything written on this board?" Dorothy stopped cleaning and looked at him. Her dark eyes shimmered with a mix of pain and something Richard couldn't quite place. "No, Doctor, I just clean," she replied softly. "Exactly." He clapped his hands. "You just clean. So stop staring at things you'll never understand and keep doing what you know how to do, scrubbing the floor." Silence filled the laboratory for a few seconds before conversations resumed. Dorothy lowered her head and went back to work, but something inside her had shifted in that moment. A flame she had kept hidden for years burned brighter. What none of them knew was that Dorothy Jenkins had been the top chemistry student in her high school class 34 years earlier. She dreamed of studying at the university, but life had other plans. Her father fell ill, the family needed money, and she had to work to support the household. All those years spent cleaning laboratories, first at the public university where she got her first job, then at private clinics, and now at this research center. She had never stopped learning. When the scientist left, she would study the boards, memorize formulas, and jot everything down in an old notebook she kept in the cleaning supply closet. On weekends, she went to the public library and devoured books on chemistry and physics. She asked Ms. Margaret, a retired teacher who attended the same church, for help understanding harder concepts. But all of this was her secret. No one had ever suspected that behind this simple woman, her hair tied in a bun, dressed in a blue uniform, was a scientific mind constantly seeking knowledge. The project occupying the research center for the past 8 months was revolutionary. They were trying to develop a new compound to treat degenerative nervous system diseases. If they could stabilize the formula, they could help millions of people worldwide. But 32 scientists had already tried and failed. Richard Thompson was under immense pressure. The investors threatened to pull funding if there were no results in 3 weeks. His career depended on this project's success, and he knew it. Frustration only made him more arrogant and cruel toward the support staff. Dorothy watched everything in silence. For months, she had cleaned up the remnants of failed experiments, noticing patterns no one else saw. There was something about how certain substances reacted when they came into contact with the multi-purpose cleaner she used. The color changed in a specific way, and it always happened with the compounds closest to the desired result. That night, after the public humiliation, Dorothy stayed late in the laboratory. Officially, she was finishing the deep cleaning, but in truth, she wanted a closer look at the materials left for disposal. She grabbed her hidden notebook and began jotting down her observations in greater detail. For years, she had recorded chemical reactions she witnessed, theories she formulated on her own, calculations she did at home. Now, for the first time, she was certain she had discovered something important. "What the hell are you doing?" Dorothy froze at the sound of Richard's voice behind her. He had returned to the laboratory to fetch some forgotten documents and found her writing in her notebook. I was just," she stammered, trying to hide the notebook. "Give me that." He yanked the notebook from her hands roughly. "You're recording confidential information. This is industrial espionage." Richard opened the notebook, and his expression changed completely. The pages were filled with complex chemical formulas, hand-drawn graphs, and elaborate theories about molecular interactions, all written in Dorothy's careful handwriting, dated over several years. "Where did you get this?" he asked, incredulous. "Who's paying you to copy our research?" "Doctor, it's not what you think," Dorothy tried to explain, her voice trembling. "I wrote all of this myself. They're my own observations." "Your observations?" Richard laughed scornfully. A cleaning lady making scientific observations? Do you think I'm stupid? Please, doctor, let me explain. You're fired, he shouted, and I'm calling security to investigate this attempted theft of intellectual property. Tears streamed down Dorothy's face, but she wasn't crying out of fear. She was crying out of anger. Anger over years of disdain, over interrupted dreams, over having to hide her intelligence to avoid bruising fragile egos. Dr. Thompson, what's going on here? The gentle voice of Jessica Carter, the team's youngest research assistant, cut through the tension. She had arrived early that morning and found her boss yelling at the cleaning lady. Jessica was different from the others. She came from a humble family, had earned a scholarship to study and never forgot her roots. She always treated Dorothy with respect, asked about her family, remembered her birthday. Jessica, good. You're here, said Richard, still clutching the notebook. I caught our employee stealing project information. She was copying our formulas. Excuse me, doctor. Jessica took the notebook from his hands and began flipping through it. These aren't copies of our formulas. This is original work. What do you mean, original work? Richard snatched the notebook back. Look at the date, doctor. This entry is from 2 years ago, before we even started this project. And this theory on molecular stabilization, we haven't even come close to that yet. Dorothy looked at Jessica with gratitude. Finally, someone was truly paying attention to what she had written. That's impossible, Richard muttered, but his voice no longer held the same certainty. Ms. Dorothy, Jessica said gently, could you explain how you wrote all this? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Dorothy took a deep breath. It was now or never. She had kept her secret for so long she had almost forgotten what it was like to speak about her passion for science. I've always loved chemistry, she began, her voice still shaky. In high school, I was the best in my class. I wanted to go to college, but my father got sick and I had to work. I never stopped studying. I just studied on my own. On your own? Jessica asked. At the public library with books I borrowed. Ms. Margaret, a retired teacher from my church, sometimes helped me. And here at work, I always paid attention to the experiments. When you all left, I would stay looking at the boards, trying to understand. Richard shook his head, still in disbelief. Even if that's true, you don't have the training to grasp such complex concepts. This here, he pointed to a specific page, is advanced molecular chemistry theory. I know, Doctor, said Dorothy, her confidence growing slowly. It took me 3 years to fully understand this theory. I asked 2 chemistry professors from the public university for help, pretending it was for a nephew who was studying. Jessica looked back and forth between Dorothy and the notebook, fascinated. Ms. Dorothy, did you make all these notes about our current project? Not exactly about your project, Dorothy explained, but about the reactions I observed in the waste I cleaned. You always threw away the experiments that didn't work, but I noticed some came close to the result, especially when they came into contact with the cleaner I use. What cleaner? Richard asked, suddenly interested. Sparkle all-purpose cleaner. When it splashed on the waste, the color changed in a specific way. Always in the experiments you said we're almost there. Jessica and Richard exchanged glances. The all-purpose cleaner had a simple stabilizer in its formula, one they'd never considered because it was too basic. And do you have any theory about why that happens? Jessica asked. Dorothy hesitated. This was her chance to show years of self-taught study, but she also knew if she was wrong, she'd be ridiculed forever. Can I show you something? Richard was about to say no, but Jessica cut in. Of course, Ms. Dorothy, show us. Dorothy walked to one of the workbenches where waste from the previous day's experiment remained. With her yellow cleaning gloves, she picked up a pipette and added a drop of the all-purpose cleaner to the liquid. The reaction was immediate. The substance, which was blue-green, shifted to a bright golden hue. My God, Jessica whispered. Doctor, are you seeing this? Richard was speechless. That color change was exactly what they'd been looking for as a marker of molecular stabilization. This is impossible, he murmured. How could a cleaning lady discover something 32 scientists couldn't? Dorothy straightened up, and for the first time in years, she spoke with a firm, clear voice. Maybe because I wasn't trying to prove I was smarter than anyone. I was just observing and learning. The lab fell silent. Richard stared at the test tube as if it were a ghost. Jessica smiled, amazed by the discovery, and Dorothy felt a mix of relief and fear. She'd shown her true capability, but she didn't know what the consequences would be. "Dr. Thompson," Jessica said, "I think we need to speak to the Institute's director immediately." "No," Richard replied quickly. "This needs proper testing first. It might have just been luck." Dorothy caught the defensive tone in his voice. Richard was afraid his position would be threatened if people found out the solution came from a cleaning staff member. "Doctor," she said firmly, "my notebook has more observations. I tested this reaction many times at home with similar products. I know it works." "You tested this at home?" Richard exclaimed. "That's dangerous. You don't have the right equipment." "I improvised, used old dishes, bought basic chemicals from the pharmacy. I never handled anything truly dangerous." Jessica flipped through the notebook again, more impressed by the minute. "Ms. Dorothy, you have records of over 50 different tests here. This is serious scientific work." "I always wanted to be a scientist," Dorothy confessed, her voice breaking. "But life didn't let me. So I became a scientist in my own way, in my own time, with what I had." Richard paced back and forth, clearly agitated. His mind quickly calculated the implications of that discovery. If it was correct, it would solve the problem that had been tormenting him for months. But it would also mean admitting he had underestimated and humiliated someone who could have helped from the start. "Jessica," he finally said, "let's run preliminary tests with this substance, but this stays between us for now." "Doctor," Dorothy interrupted, "I can help with the tests. I understand how the reaction works better than anyone." "You?" Richard laughed nervously. "You don't have credentials, no formal training. The investors would never accept that." "Then let me work with Jessica behind the scenes. I don't need credit. I just want to help." Jessica gently touched Dorothy's arm. "Miss Dorothy, you do deserve credit. If your discovery works, the world should know who made it." "Let's take it slow," Richard said, still reluctant. "First, we confirm if this actually works. Then we'll figure out the rest." Over the next 3 days, Dorothy secretly worked with Jessica to refine the discovery. Officially, she was still the cleaning lady, but in her free time, she helped with the experiments. Her practical understanding of chemical processes even surprised Jessica, who had studied for years at the university. "Ms. Dorothy," Jessica said one afternoon, "have you ever thought about going back to school? Getting a degree?" Dorothy smiled sadly. "At 52, with 2 kids to support. I don't have the time or money for that. But you have the knowledge. That's worth a lot. Knowledge without a diploma is worthless in this world, dear. I learned that long ago." Meanwhile, Richard wrestled with his own demons. The preliminary tests confirmed Dorothy's discovery was correct. The cleaning product component, when added to the formula in specific proportions, stabilized the compound surprisingly well. But he couldn't accept that he had spent months ignoring the person who had the answer right under his nose. Worse, he had humiliated her publicly for even trying to observe and learn. That Thursday, Dr. Douglas Williams, the Institute's director, called an emergency meeting. The investors were losing patience and threatening to pull funding if there were no concrete progress by Monday. "Richard," Douglas said, "are you sure there's nothing new to present? Any breakthrough, no matter how small?" Richard looked at Jessica, who was attending the meeting as an assistant. She gave him a subtle nod, encouraging him to reveal the discovery. "Actually, Director," Richard began hesitantly, "we've made some interesting progress in the last few days." "What kind of progress?" "We found a new stabilizer that seems to work. The preliminary tests are very promising." Douglas brightened immediately. "That's excellent. How did you come across this discovery?" Richard hesitated. This was the moment of truth. It was... a casual observation during experiments. Jessica gave him a disapproving look. She knew he was leaving out the truth about who had really made the discovery. "Richard," Douglas said, "I need all the details. The investors will want to know exactly how you arrived at this solution." "Of course, Director. I'll prepare a full report." When they left the meeting, Jessica confronted Richard in the hallway. "Doctor, you can't do this. Miss Dorothy deserves credit for the discovery." "Jessica, you don't understand the situation. If I say a cleaning lady solved what our entire team couldn't, they'll question our competence. It could jeopardize the whole project. Or it could show that you're humble enough to recognize talent wherever it appears. It's very risky. My career is on the line here. And Miss Dorothy's dignity doesn't matter." Richard sighed, clearly torn between fear and conscience. "Let's run the final tests first. If it really works, I promise we'll give her the credit she deserves." But Jessica wasn't convinced. She knew the pressure Richard was under and understood he'd do anything to protect his position. That night, she approached Dorothy before she left. "Miss Dorothy, may I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Jessica. Is something wrong?" "Dr. Thompson is going to present your discovery as his own. I can't let that happen." Dorothy sighed, not seeming surprised. "I sort of expected this. It's not the first time I've seen someone take credit for another person's work." "But you can't accept this. Your discovery could change millions of lives." "And it will, no matter who gets the credit. Sometimes what matters isn't being recognized, but knowing you made a difference." Jessica admired Dorothy's serenity, but couldn't accept the injustice. "Miss Dorothy, you have every right to fight for recognition. Your notebook proves the discovery is yours." "And then what? Do you think they'll accept me as an equal? Respect me? Or will they always see me as the cleaning lady who got lucky?" "It doesn't matter how they see you. It matters how you see yourself." Dorothy fell silent for a moment, reflecting on Jessica's words. "You know what, dear? All my life I've been content to stay in the shadows. Maybe it's time to step into the light." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing, the next day Dorothy arrived at work with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She'd spent the night talking with Miss Margaret, her spiritual and intellectual mentor, who encouraged her to fight for her rights. Richard was in the laboratory finalizing tests for the official presentation scheduled for Monday. When he saw Dorothy, he tried to hide his nervousness. "Good morning, Dorothy. You can go about your usual tasks today. We don't need extra help." "Dr. Thompson," Dorothy said, her voice steady, "I need to speak with you. I'm busy now, maybe later. It's about the discovery you're presenting on Monday." Richard stopped what he was doing and looked at her carefully. "What about the discovery? You know it's mine, and I know you're going to present it as yours." "Dorothy, I don't know what you're trying to achieve here, but—" "I'm trying to claim what's rightfully mine," she interrupted. "I made this discovery, I understand how it works, and I deserve recognition for it." Richard stayed silent for a few seconds, clearly uncomfortable. "Dorothy, even if that were true, you need to understand our situation is complicated. Investors expect results from qualified professionals. If they find out the solution came from someone without academic credentials, they'll question the team's competence," Dorothy finished. "Doctor, what matters more, your pride or saving lives?" "It's not about pride. It's about scientific credibility." "Scientific credibility?" Dorothy laughed bitterly. "Doctor, for 8 months, your qualified team couldn't solve a problem I identified in 2 weeks. What kind of credibility is that?" Richard flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that? You're just cleaning stuff." "No, Doctor, I'm a scientist who works as a cleaning lady, and it's time you all learned the difference." Jessica arrived at that moment and sensed the tension in the air. "Is everything okay here?" "No," Dorothy replied before Richard could speak. "Jessica, Dr. Thompson wants to present my discovery as if it were his, and I won't accept that." "Miss Dorothy," Jessica said, "you're right, I support you." "Jessica!" Richard exclaimed. "You can't take sides like this." "Doctor, with all due respect, I'm taking the side of truth. And the truth is, that Ms. Dorothy deserves recognition for the discovery. Richard realized he was losing control of the situation. You're both being irrational. Dorothy, if you try to claim authorship of this discovery, I'll have to fire you for breach of contract. Everything developed here belongs to the Institute. Doctor, Dorothy said calmly, my discovery wasn't developed just here. I have records of 2 years of research done at home in my free time, and I can prove it. How? Ms. Margaret, the teacher who helped me, kept copies of my notes. She can testify that I've been developing these theories long before you started this project. Richard paled. If Dorothy could really prove prior authorship of the discovery, the situation would be far more complicated than he'd imagined. Besides, Dorothy continued, I recorded some of our conversations about chemistry. Ms. Margaret always said I should document my learning. You recorded conversations? Richard grew increasingly nervous. I recorded lessons she gave me, explanations of theories I didn't understand. All dated, Doctor. All before your project, Jessica smiled, impressed by Dorothy's preparation. Ms. Dorothy, you've thought of everything. No, dear, I just documented my journey. I never thought I'd need to prove I'm capable of thinking. The atmosphere in the laboratory was extremely tense when Dr. Douglas arrived for a routine visit. Good morning, everyone. How are the preparations for Monday going? Richard hurried to reply, Everything's under control, Director. The final tests were positive. Excellent. Douglas noticed the tension in the room. Did something happen here? Dorothy looked at Jessica, who gave her an encouraging nod. It was now or never. Dr. Douglas, Dorothy said, stepping forward, I need to speak with you about the discovery that will be presented on Monday. Douglas looked surprised at Dorothy. It wasn't common for support staff to address him directly. Of course, Dorothy. What's this about? The discovery that will save the project was made by me, not the scientific team. The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas looked alternately at Dorothy, Richard, and Jessica, trying to understand what was happening. What do you mean, Dorothy? Doctor, Richard quickly interjected, there's been a misunderstanding. Dorothy made some interesting observations during her work, but the discovery is the result of the team's collective effort. That's not true, Dorothy said firmly. I identified the problem, developed the theory, and tested the solution. I have proof of all of it. Douglas looked visibly confused. What kind of proof? Dorothy pulled her notebook from her uniform pocket. 2 years of notes, Doctor. Theories developed at home, tests done in my free time, records of conversations with my mentor, all documented and dated. Douglas took the notebook and began flipping through it. His expression changed as he read the detailed notes. This is high-level scientific work. How did you learn all this, Dorothy? By studying on my own, Doctor. I always wanted to be a scientist, but I never had the chance to go to college, so I studied my way. And this specific discovery, he pointed to notes on molecular stabilizers. I've been observing the reactions of discarded experiments for months. I noticed that certain compounds reacted in interesting ways when they came into contact with cleaning products. I developed a theory at home and confirmed it here in the laboratory. Douglas looked at Richard, who was visibly embarrassed. Richard, did you know about this? Director, the situation is more complicated than it seems. I caught Ms. Dorothy taking notes and accused her of spying, Richard admitted reluctantly. When I saw the notebook, I thought she was copying our research. But when we tested her theory, did it work? Douglas asked. Yes, Jessica replied. And the results are better than anything we've achieved before. Douglas closed the notebook and looked seriously at Dorothy. Dorothy, do you understand the importance of this discovery? I do, Doctor. That's why I can't let someone take credit that isn't theirs. And you, Richard, were you planning to present this as your team's work? Richard hesitated before answering. I thought it would be better for the project's credibility. Credibility? Douglas raised his voice. Richard, scientific discovery isn't about social credibility. It's about truth. If Dorothy made this discovery, she deserves recognition. But Director, Richard protested, how do we explain to investors that our scientific team needed help from a cleaning lady? We'll explain that we had the intelligence to listen to all voices and recognize talent wherever it appears. Douglas replied firmly. Dorothy felt an emotion she hadn't experienced in decades. Finally, someone in authority was acknowledging her worth. "Dr. Douglas," she said, "I don't want to cause trouble. I just want the truth to be known." "Dorothy, you're not causing trouble. You're solving the biggest problem we had. And more than that, you're teaching us an important lesson about humility and recognition." Richard knew he had lost the battle, but made one last attempt. "Director, even if Dorothy contributed significantly, she doesn't have the formal qualifications to be officially credited in scientific research." "Richard," Douglas said firmly, "formal qualifications aren't synonymous with intelligence. Dorothy demonstrated practical knowledge that our entire team lacked. That's worth more than any degree." Jessica smiled, happy to see justice being done. "Director," she said, "Ms. Dorothy didn't just make the discovery. She understands the process better than any of us. It would be important for her to participate in the investor presentation." Douglas agreed immediately. "Excellent idea, Jessica. Dorothy, would you like to present your discovery on Monday?" Dorothy felt a mix of euphoria and terror. I've never presented anything officially before." "Don't worry," Douglas said. "Jessica can help you prepare, and I'll be there to support you." "What about me?" Richard asked, clearly worried about his position. "You'll continue leading the project, Richard, but now with Dorothy as an official consultant, and I hope you learn to value every team member, regardless of their position." In the days that followed, Dorothy underwent a complete transformation. Jessica helped her prepare a professional presentation, explaining her discovery clearly and convincingly. "Ms. Dorothy," Jessica said during one rehearsal, "you have a natural talent for explaining complex concepts simply." "It's because I've always had to figure things out on my own," Dorothy replied. "When you don't have a teacher, you learn to explain things to yourself. That's a valuable skill. Many scientists know a lot but can't convey knowledge." During the preparations, Dorothy discovered her story had spread throughout the institute. Other support staff began seeking her out, sharing their own observations and ideas about the projects they worked on. "Ms. Dorothy," said Shannon, a lab technician, "for months I've noticed strange patterns in the equipment I clean. I never said anything because I thought no one would care. Tell me, Shannon, every observation could be important." Dorothy was discovering she wasn't the only employee who observed and learned in silence. There was an entire universe of practical knowledge being ignored simply because it came from people considered unqualified. Richard, meanwhile, was undergoing his own transformation. The initial humiliation had given way to deep reflection about his prejudices and behavior. "Jessica," he said one afternoon, "I need to apologize for doubting Dorothy, for trying to steal her credit, for being arrogant. Doctor, what matters is that you recognize it and that you learn from the experience." "You know what bothers me the most?" Richard continued. "Knowing Dorothy was there all along, observing, learning, willing to help, and I treated her as invisible. Many people do that, Doctor. They judge by uniforms, by diplomas, by social status, but intelligence doesn't recognize those barriers. You're right, and I want to change that. I want to create an environment where everyone feels valued and heard." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The day of the presentation finally arrived. Dorothy had come to the institute 2 hours early, nervous but determined. She wore a white blouse borrowed from Jessica and dress pants she had bought especially for the occasion. "How are you feeling, Ms. Dorothy?" Douglas asked when he met her in the laboratory. "Nervous but ready," she replied. "I've spent my whole life preparing for this moment, even without knowing it. Remember, you understand this discovery better than anyone. Trust your knowledge." The investors arrived at noon. 5 serious people in dark suits, clearly expecting concrete results, or they would cut funding. "Gentlemen," Douglas said, opening the meeting, "today we have the pleasure of presenting a revolutionary discovery that solves all the stabilization problems we've faced." "Dr. Williams," said the lead investor, Mr. Stephen Morgan, "we expect something substantial. We've already invested a great deal of money in this project." "It will be more than substantial, Mr. Morgan. But before showing the results, I'd like to introduce the person responsible for the discovery. Douglas gestured to Dorothy, who stood nervously. Gentlemen, this is Dorothy Jenkins, the scientist responsible for the discovery that saves our project. The investors looked confused at Dorothy in her work uniform. Excuse me, Dr. Williams, Morgan said, but there must be some mistake. Isn't this our scientific team? There's no mistake, Douglas replied. Dorothy works here as support staff, but she's the one who made the discovery you'll see today. A cleaning lady? Murmured another investor, visibly skeptical. Dorothy took a deep breath and remembered Ms. Margaret's words. My dear, knowledge is knowledge, no matter where it comes from. Gentlemen, she said, her voice growing steadier, I know my appearance isn't what you expected, but science doesn't wear a uniform. She walked to the bench where she had prepared the demonstration. For 8 months, your scientific team tried to stabilize this compound, she continued, holding up a vial of blue-green liquid. 32 specialists failed, not because they weren't smart, but because they were looking in the wrong place. Dorothy picked up a pipette and added 2 drops of the cleaning product to the compound. The transformation was instant. The liquid turned into a bright gold. As you can see, she said, the stabilization happens immediately. The stabilizer was here all along, being used to clean up the residue from failed experiments. The investors fell silent, impressed by the demonstration. How did you discover this? Asked Morgan. By observing, sir. For 2 years, I cleaned up the residue from these experiments. I noticed certain substances reacted when they came into contact with the product I used. At home, I developed theories about why this happened. I tested with materials I could afford, documented everything. Dorothy showed her notebook. 2 years of self-taught research, theories, tests, observations, all recorded here. And you did this alone? Asked another investor. With help from Ms. Margaret, a retired teacher who taught me what I couldn't learn on my own, and with a lot of studying in public libraries. Morgan took the notebook and began flipping through it. This is scientific work of excellent quality. How did you learn all this? I always wanted to be a scientist, sir. Life didn't give me that opportunity in the traditional way, so I created my own. Dr. Williams, said Morgan, this is extraordinary, not just for the discovery itself, but for what it represents. How so, Mr. Morgan? You've uncovered something the entire scientific industry should learn. Talent doesn't recognize social or educational barriers. This woman did alone what an entire team couldn't. Dorothy felt tears of emotion in her eyes. After decades of being invisible, she was finally being seen and valued. Mr. Morgan, she said, I can assure you this discovery is just the beginning. There's so much more potential being wasted in laboratories around the world. How so? Support staff notice things scientists don't see. They spot patterns, notice details, make connections, but no one asks what they think. Richard, who had been observing the presentation, stood up. Mr. Morgan, Dorothy is right. Over these past days, we've discovered that several staff members have valuable insights about our projects. We're planning to create a program to include all voices in scientific research. That's a brilliant idea, said Morgan. Innovation can come from anywhere. You've just shown us that. Douglas smiled, proud of the transformation happening in his team. Gentlemen, based on this discovery and the results it produces, we'd like to propose not just continuing the current project, but expanding into new research under the joint leadership of Richard and Dorothy. Joint leadership? Asked one of the investors. Yes, replied Douglas. Dorothy will be promoted to senior scientific consultant. She'll begin an accelerated chemistry degree program funded by the Institute while working full-time on research. Dorothy could hardly believe what she was hearing. Dr. Douglas, are you serious? Completely serious, Dorothy. You've proven you have the knowledge and ability. Now we're giving you the formal credentials you deserve. Morgan clapped slowly. Dr. Williams, this is exactly the kind of innovation we want to support. Not only do we approve continued funding, but we're willing to double the investment to back this new model of collaborative research. The room erupted in smiles and congratulations. Dorothy hugged Jessica, who had been pivotal in her journey. Thank you, dear. Without you, I'd never have had the courage to fight for my rights. Ms. Dorothy, you always had that courage. You just needed someone to remind you. Richard approached, visibly moved. Dorothy, I owe you a huge apology. Not just for the humiliation, but for almost stealing your discovery. Dr. Thompson, what matters is that we learned from each other. Now we can truly work together. It would be an honor to work with you. I'm sure I have much to learn. Douglas caught everyone's attention. Everyone. I think this is a historic moment. Not just for the scientific discovery, but for the human discovery we made today. I've learned that true leadership is about recognizing and valuing everyone's potential. Dorothy excused herself and addressed the investors. Gentlemen, before we finish, I'd like to make a request. Of course, Dorothy, what do you need? I know other staff in other laboratories who have valuable observations. Could you consider expanding this model to the entire network of institutes? Morgan smiled. Dorothy, you're not just a brilliant scientist, but also a visionary. Of course, we'll consider it. In fact, I'll propose that you lead this expansion. At that moment, Dorothy understood her journey was just beginning. She had spent decades dreaming of being a scientist, and now she wouldn't just fulfill that dream, she'd help others fulfill theirs too. The weeks that followed brought profound changes to the Institute. Dorothy began her accelerated degree while working as a consultant. Her desk was next to Richard's, and they developed a respectful and productive partnership. Dorothy, Richard said one morning, I have a proposal for you. What kind of proposal? How about we create a scientific mentorship program for support staff? You could lead it. Richard, that's a wonderful idea, but I've barely started my own formal education. That's exactly why you're the right person. You understand the struggles, you know the obstacles, you can guide others walking the same path. Dorothy fell silent for a moment, considering the proposal. You know what? You're right, and I know the perfect person to help me. Who? Ms. Margaret. She's 68, a brilliant retired teacher, and loves to teach. She could coordinate the educational side of the program. That would be perfect. Should we propose this to Douglas? A few days later, the program was approved, and Margaret had been hired as the educational coordinator. The first class had 12 support staff from various institutes in the region. Good afternoon, everyone, Dorothy said in the first session. My name is Dorothy Jenkins, and 2 months ago, I was cleaning this very lab where I'm now a researcher. The students looked at her with admiration and hope. You're here because someone recognized your potential, but what matters most is that you recognize it in yourselves. Ms. Dorothy, asked Shannon, the technician who had enrolled in the program, how did you find the courage to show your discovery? Shannon, courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. I was terrified when I confronted Dr. Richard, but I knew it was the right thing to do. What if we're not as smart as you? Dorothy smiled gently. My dear, intelligence isn't about quantity. It's about application. Each of you has unique observations and insights. My role here is to help you develop those abilities. Ms. Margaret, sitting at the back of the room, smiled proudly at her former student. Dorothy, she said, you've become a natural educator. I learned from the best, Ms. Margaret. The program became an impressive success. Within 6 months, 4 staff members had made significant discoveries in their respective labs. Dorothy's story began spreading through the national scientific community. One day, Dorothy received an unexpected call. Hello, this is Dorothy. Ms. Dorothy, my name is Melissa Wilson. I'm a journalist with Science Today. We'd like to do a story about your journey. A story about me? Your discovery and your path have inspired people across the country. We want to share your story to motivate others who might be in similar situations. Dorothy hesitated. She had never imagined her story could interest anyone beyond her work circle. I don't know if I'm interesting enough for a magazine. Ms. Dorothy, you're more interesting than you think. Your story shows that science is for everyone, that knowledge doesn't recognize social barriers. In that case, I accept, but on one condition. I want the story to include other staff members who are making discoveries too. Of course, that would make it even better. We can do a special feature on the movement you started. The article was published 2 months later and had a national impact. Dorothy received invitations to speak at universities. Other institutes requested her consultation to implement similar programs. And hundreds of support staff reached out, sharing their own scientific observations. "Dorothy," Douglas said during a board meeting, "you've created a quiet revolution in American science." "Douglas, I just showed that being a scientist isn't about profession, it's about calling, and calling doesn't pick a social class." "Exactly. And that's why I'd like to propose your appointment as Director of Scientific Inclusion at the Institute." Dorothy was speechless. "Director? I barely have a year of college." "Dorothy, you have something more valuable than any degree, practical wisdom and the ability to change lives. Do you accept?" "I accept, but with conditions." "Name them." "First, Ms. Margaret becomes the official educational director. Second, we create a scholarship fund for staff who want to study. Third, we establish partnerships with public schools to show that science is for everyone." "I accept all your conditions," Douglas said immediately. A year later, Dorothy was in her new office, reviewing proposals for new inclusion projects. Her desk was covered with letters from people thanking her for inspiring their own scientific journeys. Jessica knocked on the door. "Miss Dorothy, may I come in?" "Of course, Jessica. Actually, just Dorothy now. No need for Ms. anymore." "To me, you'll always be Miss Dorothy. It's a sign of affection and respect." Jessica sat in the chair across the desk. "Dorothy, I have news to share." "Good or bad?" "Great news. I just got confirmation. Our compound has been approved for human clinical trials. In 2 years, it could be saving real lives." Dorothy felt a deep emotion. Her discovery, which began with observing cleaning residues, was about to become a reality for millions. "Jessica, do you know what this means?" "That you changed the world." "No, dear. It means we all changed the world. You, me, Richard, Douglas, Ms. Margaret. We proved that science is teamwork, and teamwork includes everyone." Just then, Richard appeared at the door. "Dorothy, may I interrupt?" "Of course, Richard. Come in." "I wanted to thank you again. These 2 years working with you have made me a better scientist and a better person." "Richard, the change was mutual. You taught me it's possible to grow, to recognize mistakes, and to become better. And I'd like to make an official proposal. How about we become permanent partners? Your way of doing science perfectly complements mine. I accept, but as equal partners. No hierarchy based on degrees. Of course, equal partners with complementary talents." That evening, Dorothy left the institute and walked through her neighborhood. She passed the public library where she had studied for years, greeted Miss Barbara from the bakery who always asked about her studies, and waved to the children playing in the park. Upon arriving home, she found her 2 now adult children waiting for her. "Mom," said Robert, the eldest, "we saw the feature about you on TV today. We're so proud." "Thank you, my son, but you've always been my greatest achievement." "Mom," said Samantha, the youngest, "you inspired me to go back to school. I'm taking the college entrance exam for biology." Dorothy hugged her children, moved. "Samantha, you've always been smart. You just needed to believe in yourself." "I learned that from you, Mom. It's never too late to chase our dreams." That night, Dorothy sat at her desk to work on her final thesis. The topic was Democratization of Scientific Knowledge, a case study on inclusion and innovation. As she wrote, she reflected on her journey. She had started as an invisible cleaning lady and become a recognized voice in the scientific community. But what mattered most wasn't her personal transformation. It was the transformation she had inspired in others. Her old notebook of notes was framed on the wall, alongside her first scientific diploma and photos of students from the inclusion program. Each item told part of a story of perseverance, discovery, and change. 3 years later, Dorothy stood on the main stage of the National Science Congress, presenting the results of the National Program for Scientific Inclusion, which had already been implemented in over 200 institutes across the country. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said to an audience of 1,000, "when I began this journey, my goal was simple: to be recognized for the discovery I had made. Today, our goal is much greater: to ensure that every American with scientific potential has the opportunity to develop it." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. In the last 3 years, our program has identified and developed over 1,000 scientific talents in non-traditional roles. Support staff who became researchers, technicians who made important discoveries, ordinary people who revolutionized entire fields of science. Dorothy paused and looked at the audience. But the most important lesson we've learned is this: science isn't the property of an educated elite. Science belongs to humanity, and every human being has the potential to contribute to it. The applause was deafening. After the presentation, Dorothy was approached by a young journalist. "Dr. Dorothy, what's the next step for your work?" "The next step is international. We've received invitations from countries in Latin America and Africa to implement similar programs. American science will show the world that inclusion drives innovation." "And personally, what are your plans?" Dorothy smiled. "Personally, I want to keep being Dorothy Jenkins, the same woman who observed, learned, and dreamed while cleaning laboratories. Only now, instead of cleaning countertops, I'm cleaning up prejudices." One last question. What advice would you give to someone who feels invisible and underestimated? To remember that society may not see your worth, but that doesn't mean you don't have any. Keep observing, learning, growing, and when your time to shine comes, be ready, because everyone has a discovery waiting to be made. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story of perseverance and discovery. Do you think Dorothy made the right choices in fighting for the recognition she deserved? And you, have you ever been in a situation where you felt underestimated because of your position or appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like to support more inspiring stories like this one. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving narratives.